General Hospital spoilers reveal that Willow had convinced herself that the moment she slipped the syringe into the hospital trash bin, she had severed the final thread tying her to the poison now coursing through Drew's veins. It was a simple gesture, a flick of the wrist, a swift burial of evidence beneath layers of discarded gauze and mundane debris. And she believed that such an effortless act could erase what she had done. She thought secrecy worked like a locked box. Hide the key and the truth stays buried. But secrets, especially the kind fueled by desperation, and crafted through deception, never obey the people who create them. They leak through seams, stain the edges of perfect lies, and cling to everything like smoke. Willow believed she had mastered the art of concealment, but the truth was already slipping beyond her grasp. Waiting for the right eyes to notice. Those eyes belonged to Alexis, a woman whose instincts had been sharpened by years of confronting liars, manipulators, and criminals masquerading as victims. Willow never imagined that someone like Alexis would step into the shadows of her plan. Yet, fate had an elegant cruelty in choosing exactly the wrong person to stumble upon the one object that could unravel everything. As Willow hovered over Drew's hospital bed, wearing the mask of a devastated wife, Alexis began constructing the threads of a narrative that Willow had failed to anticipate. Alexis noticed what others dismissed, the tension frozen in Willow's shoulders, the unnatural tremble in her voice whenever she mentioned the timeline of Drew's collapse, the way her eyes flickered with too much awareness each time a doctor mentioned toxins or neurological damage. These were not details the average person would latch onto, but to Alexis they were alarms. She did not look at Willow with suspicion at first, but rather with curiosity, and curiosity once sparked, always searched for fuel. She found it when she crossed paths with the very trash bin Willow had so confidently chosen as the graveyard for her syringe. Something about the discarded item caught her attention. A faint residue of liquid, a broken seal, a subtle but undeniable wrongness. Alexis was not a medical professional. But she had lived long enough to recognize when something did not belong, and the syringe radiated danger like a whisper trying to be heard. Willow, blissfully unaware that her perfect disposal had been compromised, continued rehearsing her role with increasing intensity. Every tear she shed beside Drew's bed felt manufactured yet necessary. Every tremor in her voice served as camouflage. She believed the world around her could be manipulated through performance alone. If she cried long enough, trembled convincingly enough, and clung to Drew's motionless hand with enough despair, she believed the hospital staff would never question her involvement. She imagined herself as the orchestrator of a fragile narrative. The loyal wife, the tragic caretaker, the broken woman facing the unbearable. But narratives controlled through fear always fracture. And Willow was too deep into her own illusion to notice the cracks forming beneath her feet. The moment Alexis took a closer look at the syringe, the energy surrounding Drew's case shifted. Alexis felt unease settle in her chest. The cold familiar sensation warning her that something far darker was at play. She replayed every interaction she had witnessed in the past few hours. Willow's responses suddenly felt rehearsed. Her grief seemed excessively polished. If Willow had nothing to hide, why did she act like someone expecting to be accused? The pressure inside Alexis grew as she began to connect the dots that no one else bothered to assemble. She knew that Drew's sudden neurological collapse did not align with natural causes. She knew that even a minor irregularity in the medical waste bin could hold significance. And she knew better than anyone that coincidences rarely existed in Port Charles without carrying a hidden motive. While Alexis pieced together what Willow never wanted uncovered, Willow herself felt an unexpected unease rising inside her. It wasn't guilt. She had long since suppressed that sensation, but a discomfort rooted in the realization that she had been forced to adjust the narrative more frequently than she expected. She kept finding herself correcting details, reshaping her story, and adding new layers to her manufactured grief. Each adjustment felt like tightening a noose around her own neck. She had always believed she could manipulate perception, but the more she controlled the story, the more unpredictable it became. She needed Drew silent and she needed the world to believe she was devoted to him. But she did not anticipate how suffocating the performance would become. Every time a nurse approached her with updates, her heart kicked with dread, not fear of Drew's decline, but fear of someone noticing the wrong note in her emotional symphony. Alexis spent hours turning the syringe over in her mind, examining the possibilities like pieces of a puzzle whose edges did not quite align. She felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. If this syringe was what she suspected, it meant someone had attempted to harm Drew intentionally. And if that someone was Willow, then the quiet fate the young woman presented had been nothing but a costume. Alexis recognized the desperation behind such actions, the kind driven by fear of losing control. Yet she also recognized madness, the sort that blossoms quietly in someone who has convinced herself that the world owes her absolution. Willow had not simply made a mistake. She had crafted an entire reality where her survival depended on the incapacitation of another human being. And Alexis, holding the first tangible clue, now carried the burden of a truth that had the power to destroy Willow's carefully constructed fantasy. Willow's mind spiraled the longer she stood beside Drew, staring at his paralyzed form. She thought controlling him physically would silence the past. But instead, his stillness became a mirror reflecting everything she feared. She saw the truth she was trying to bury, the panic she was trying to outrun, and the monstrosity she was becoming. She had wanted power, but now she felt hunted by the possibility that someone might expose her. Every shift of a shadow in the hallway, every glance cast in her direction, every whispered conversation between doctors felt like a threat. Her paranoia grew as the world around her tightened. She imagined Alexis watching her, imagined investigators examining her actions, imagined the truth rising like smoke from the ashes she thought she had concealed. Alexis, meanwhile, struggled with her own turmoil. The syringe was more than evidence. It was a moral crossroads. If she pursued the truth, she would ignite a firestorm around a woman who had already built her identity on fragile emotional scaffolding. But if she remained silent, she would allow a potential murderer to continue shaping the narrative unchallenged. Alexis weighed the consequences of exposing Willow's deception. She considered the shockwaves it would send through Port Charles. The revelation would shatter many relationships and unleash chaos. Yet she could not ignore the reality that Drew's condition was not a tragic accident, but the consequence of someone's deliberate malice. The syringe symbolized a truth begging not to be dismissed. Willow felt her world tightening as her lies grew heavier. She could no longer distinguish between the story she told others and the story she told herself. She believed she had acted out of necessity, convincing herself that Drew deserved to be silenced. But beneath that justification was a frantic fear of losing Michael, losing control, losing the fragile image she had built. Now that Alexis held the evidence, Willow sensed the shift without knowing exactly what had happened. She felt watched, exposed, vulnerable, like a creature whose camouflage had faded too quickly. Her attempt to manipulate the narrative had birthed a monster larger than herself. And the monster was no longer under her control. Alexis knew that once she chose a direction, there would be no turning back. She would either bring light to the darkest corner of the hospital or allow Willow's delusion of control to continue infecting everything around her. The syringe lay between them like a silent declaration. The truth was alive, pulsing, demanding to be acknowledged. And good or bad, someone would have to face it. Willow, sensing the crumbling of her illusion, yet unable to stop it, felt the panic coil tighter. The story she had tried to rewrite was slipping from her hands. Control was no longer hers. And as Alexis stepped closer to confronting the truth, Willow's carefully constructed world prepared to collapse under the weight of its own lies. Willow moved through the hospital corridors with a kind of trembling poise that she had perfected over the past several days. A performance sharpened not by grief but by cold calculation. Wearing her sorrow like an immaculate costume, while inside her mind she replayed the moment, she believed she had secured her freedom. She had convinced herself that she should feel triumphant, even vindicated. After surviving not one but two crimes against Drew, shooting him and later injecting him with a toxin designed to mimic a catastrophic neurological collapse. And she took a twisted comfort in the idea that Drew's suffering was simply the final echo of the chaos he had inflicted on nearly every resident of Port Charles. Yet the satisfaction she clung to was fragile, brittle around the edges, because despite her outward composure, there remained a constant, gnawing awareness that she had built her sanctuary from lies, and lies had a way of decaying faster than anyone expected. Still, she kept acting, weeping on command, trembling beside Drew's bed, pressing her face into her hands as if despair were clawing at her from the inside. And she knew everyone around her was buying the performance. They saw a devastated wife losing the man she loved, not the woman who had orchestrated his destruction. Her mask fit perfectly, but the truth simmered beneath her skin like a fever she could not shake. In the quiet corners of the hospital, however, where Willow believed the world was too distracted to pay attention, Alexis moved with the stillness of someone who had seen far too many lies in her lifetime, not to recognize when something stank beneath the surface. Willow never imagined Alexis would be the one to notice the irregularity in the medical waste bin. Never imagined that the syringe she discarded in such a calculated clinical motion would catch Alexis's trained eye. Willow thought she had erased the evidence forever. But Alexis found it not by accident, but with the instinct of someone who had learned to recognize when a crime disguised itself as coincidence. The syringe seemed insignificant at first, buried under wrappers and gauze, yet its residue, the faint chemical scent clinging to the plastic, and the unnatural way it had been discarded, all triggered the alarms that Willow naively believed she had avoided. Alexis felt a chill as she lifted it, sensing the presence of a story that someone wanted desperately to bury. And from that moment forward, the balance of power began shifting away from Willow without her even realizing it. As Willow clung to Drew's motionless hand, she let herself imagine that she was safe, that no one suspected a thing, that all the tears she produced were convincing enough to drown everyone's doubts. She believed that as long as Drew remained trapped inside his unresponsive body, unable to speak or move or reveal what she had done, she could control every aspect of the narrative. She could appear devoted, fearful, loving. She could insist she was shattered by his condition. She could manipulate the doctors into believing she was an overwhelmed wife, trying to process an unexpected tragedy. But Willow was too focused on maintaining her image to notice the subtle ways her illusion was beginning to fray. Her story changed slightly each time she told it. Her emotional reactions grew too exaggerated, and her attempts to insert herself into every detail of Drew's care started drawing silent, curious glances. She felt the air grow heavier each time someone mentioned toxicology. Each time a nurse reviewed Drew's labs, each time a specialist wondered aloud what had triggered the sudden neurological collapse. Willow fought to keep her expression neutral, to swallow her panic before it reached her eyes. But the strain of pretending was beginning to grind against her nerves. Meanwhile, Alexis stood alone with the syringe, weighing the gravity of what she had found. She understood instantly and instinctively that this was not a misplaced medical tool, but a weapon, a mechanism of harm wielded by someone who wanted Drew silenced permanently. And once that truth took root, Alexis could not unsee the inconsistencies in Willow's behavior, the stiffness in her posture, the too perfect sorrow. The way she hovered just a little too close to Drew's bed, as if proximity itself could erase suspicion. Alexis felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the instinct of a woman who had been dismissed too many times, whose credibility had been questioned, whose rights had been stripped by circumstances she could not control. Suddenly, she possessed something that could restore her sense of power, leverage, and not just any leverage, but the kind that could reshape her future, especially the future of Scout, the child she had fought to protect, only to be pushed aside by the chaos surrounding Drew's life and decisions. The syringe became a symbol of possibility, a door she could open not for vengeance, but for justice, or perhaps something darker, an opportunity to reclaim what she lost. By forcing Willow to face the consequences of her own crimes. Willow sensed the shift long before she understood its source. It began as a quiet unease, a prickling sensation under her skin whenever Alexis walked into the room. As if Alexis carried an invisible light capable of exposing the darkest parts of her. Without knowing why, Willow felt hunted. Her carefully curated performance required more effort than before. Her hands shook, not from pretend fear, but from real anxiety. Her breathing grew shallow each time she caught Alexis watching her. She felt the weight of suspicion even when no one said a word. The narrative she believed she controlled so expertly was slipping away from her grip. Panic followed her like a shadow, whispering that something she believed gone forever had resurfaced. She did not yet know the syringe had been found, but her instinct screamed that someone was closing in, someone who saw beyond her mask, someone who understood the art of uncovering buried truths. Alexis carried the knowledge with a cold, deliberate steadiness. She did not confront Willow immediately. She did not rush to the police or burst into accusations. Instead, she examined the situation through a lens of opportunity. Willow had manipulated, concealed, and destroyed without hesitation. Willow had nearly cost Drew his life, and had done so with enough cunning to fool everyone else. And for Alexis, a woman who had been undermined, dismissed, and stripped of her guardianship rights. The idea of turning this discovery into a strategic advantage began to take shape. She recognized that Willow cared more about protecting her image than anything else. That exposure terrified her more than punishment itself. And that fear could be used, shaped, carved into something useful. Alexis began imagining scenarios in which Willow's guilt could become her own bargaining chip. She did not need to destroy Willow publicly. She could simply force Willow to comply, to surrender. To give Alexis the one thing she wanted back, Scout. As Willow continued spiraling into a psychological maze of paranoia and self-preservation, the world around her began to feel distorted. The hospital lights felt too bright, the footsteps in the hallway too loud, the shadows too animated. She found herself scanning every face, searching for signs that someone knew what she had done. And with each stolen glance toward Alexis, her stomach twisted. Alexis had become a silent threat, a storm she could feel but not see, a presence that seemed to pierce through her performance and expose the rotting truth behind it. Willow's fear grew not from guilt, but from the realization that she no longer controlled the direction of the story. Someone else had stepped into that role. Someone who understood leverage far better than she did. In the end, Willow found herself trapped in the very illusion she crafted. The lies that once protected her now felt like chains tightening around her throat. The victory she believed she earned now tasted bitter, laced with the dread of impending collapse. And Alexis, holding the syringe that could ruin everything, became the quiet architect of a new power dynamic. She did not need to speak her intentions. The unspoken threat was enough. Willow had harmed Drew and escaped the consequences for now. But she had also handed Alexis the weapon capable of rewriting the future. And as Alexis contemplated the path ahead, she realized she could reclaim her place in Scout's life, not by pleading or fighting publicly, but by letting Willow's own crimes become the foundation of her control. Willow thought she had buried the truth, but Alexis now owned it, and the balance between them shifted with the weight of inevitability. Willow could continue pretending to mourn Drew, but she would soon learn that survival comes with a cost, and Alexis was prepared to collect every last piece of it. Alexis had convinced herself that holding Willow's secret would give her power, that the syringe tucked away in her possession would serve as a weapon. She could point in whatever direction she wished. Yet, the longer she kept the truth buried, the more it began to infect her thoughts like a spreading poison. At first, she believed she was acting strategically, preserving her advantage while waiting for the perfect moment to use it. But strategy slowly dissolved into obsession. She replayed every moment she had seen Willow near Drew's bedside, every trembling breath, every false gesture of grief, every too perfect expression of emotional collapse. And instead of feeling victorious for having uncovered the truth, she felt increasingly trapped by it. She told herself she was doing the right thing by staying silent. That exposing Willow too soon would cost her the leverage she needed to reclaim Scout. But beneath that rationalization grew a darker reality. She was now protecting the very crime she should have condemned. And protecting it meant becoming entangled in it. The weight of that entanglement pressed against her mind with a pressure she had not expected. Every hour she remained silent toward her conscience, shredding the boundaries she once relied on to distinguish right from wrong. She paced through her home with the syringe hidden in a drawer she opened and closed far too often. Unable to stop herself from checking it, as if the object itself might vanish or transform or betray her, she began waking at night drenched in sweat. Imagining footsteps approaching, imagining police knocking, imagining Drew suddenly awakening and naming her as an accomplice simply because she had hesitated too long. The fear spiraled into something corrosive, eating at her belief that she was still in control. She tried to convince herself that her silence was temporary, that she was merely gathering strength before making the decisive move. Yet the longer she waited, the more difficult action became. Silence hardened, settling into her like sediment, and with it came guilt she tried desperately to choke down. Meanwhile, Willow continued performing her counterfeit grief with unsettling ease. Unaware of the psychological unraveling she had triggered in the very woman holding her fate. Alexis found that the more Willow cried in public, the more she shook in Drew's hospital room, the more she touched his hand as if she were terrified of losing him. The more Alexis felt her own mind splinter. She saw Willow manipulating everyone, doctors, family, friends. And instead of stepping forward to shatter the illusion, Alexis found herself complicit in maintaining it. Each time she allowed Willow's lies to spread without challenge, she felt a piece of her integrity crumble. She began to question not only Willow's morality, but her own. What kind of woman allowed a crime like this to go unpunished? What kind of mother protected a murderer simply because it served her interests? Was she becoming one of them, one of the people Port Charles whispered about? The ones who had darkness behind their own desperate justifications? Her obsession tightened like a vice around her skull. She told herself repeatedly that she was only keeping the secret to regain guardianship of Scout, that she was moving with purpose. Yet the truth was far murkier. She had crossed a threshold the moment she chose silence. She had stepped into the orbit of Willow's crime, unable to escape its pull. She began imagining scenarios where someone discovered the syringe and accused her instead, imagining a version of events where her hesitation became the crime. And with each fear came a deeper panic, that perhaps she was no longer the one guiding the narrative at all. Perhaps the secret was guiding her. Perhaps Willow's deception had become a living force that consumed everything it touched, including Alexis herself. The more Alexis tried to maintain control, the more it slipped away. She snapped at small noises. She avoided mirrors because she hated the reflection of a woman who no longer resembled the one she believed herself to be. She crafted arguments in her head about how she would justify her silence if ever questioned. But each argument sounded weaker than the last. She could no longer distinguish whether she was protecting herself, protecting Scout, or protecting Willow. The lines blurred until the entire situation became an indistinguishable mass of fear, guilt, and frantic justification. She had meant to hold the truth steady, but instead it shook her down to her core. Meanwhile, her fear of exposure intensified. Every ringing phone sent a jolt through her spine. Every unexpected visitor made her heart pound. Every mention of Drew's condition felt like a needle piercing into her consciousness. She imagined doctors discovering the toxin, imagined Michael asking questions, imagined Willow turning on her the moment she felt cornered. Alexis knew Willow was capable of manipulation, capable of deceit, capable of violence, cloaked in fragility, and she feared that Willow might one day try to destroy her if she sensed that Alexis held the key to her downfall. That fear grew into paranoia, the paranoia into obsession, and the obsession into a subtle madness that hovered just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The reality was simple but unbearable. Alexis was now hiding a crime she had no business hiding, and the cost of that silence had begun eroding everything she once trusted about herself. She could feel the danger expanding outward, reaching into parts of her life she had fought so hard to rebuild. Her professional clarity wavered. Her moral compass twisted itself into unrecognizable shapes. She began pulling away from people she loved, afraid they would somehow sense the truth in her eyes. She had intended to gain power by holding Willow's secret. But instead, she had become shaped by the very darkness she tried to control. The secret was no longer a tool. It was a toxin of its own. One slowly unraveling her from the inside. And as the pressure mounted, Alexis realized with a horrifying clarity that she might already be too far gone. The attempt to manipulate the situation to outmaneuver Willow to maintain control of something so volatile had begun consuming her sanity. She could feel her identity fracturing, her intentions warping, her judgment slipping. What began as leverage had turned into a curse, and she was trapped in a story spinning wildly beyond her grasp. The truth she carried had the power to destroy Willow, but it was destroying Alexis first.